Hey, Julie, how are you?
Great.
Good to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about opposite sex friendships in marriage and whether or not those can exist and kind of what the research says about that. So I know you and I are both career-driven women, and we work on a team in our ministry with both males and females. So that dynamic is definitely in place for us. And I know that we aren't alone in this. Like, couples all over the world are either working in their careers with males and females, or they're participating in church groups, or they're volunteering. And whatever the case may be, there are times where they make friendships with those of the opposite sex. And so there are a lot of different perspectives on this, on, how close is too close to get in those type of relationships? And even, can they exist? Like, are you allowed to have friends of the opposite sex if you are in a marriage relationship? So we're going to dive in.
You have 100% gone to meddling.
Yeah. So let's just start with the question that's on everyone's mind that we've been teasing up to this point. Is it okay? Can you have opposite sex friendships in marriage?
It all depends. How's that for a safe answer?
Yes.
So here are the things that people really need to think about, because there is no absolute when it comes to this, but there are definitely things that couples need to keep in mind. I've had lots of people say, this person has been my friend since I was 3 years old. We're like brothers and sisters. So what is the problem here? There isn't necessarily a problem if you recognize, one, your marriage relationship is first and foremost. And so that means that your spouse has to be comfortable with the relationship. And if they're uncomfortable, that has to be addressed. And it can't just be, you need to get over yourself. This is your deal, not mine, because now you're married. So there are changes that are going to occur in that relationship. Things that you might have talked about before would not be appropriate for you to talk to this person about, especially when it comes to your marriage. If there's anything that I have seen get couples sideways, it's doing their marriage work with someone that they thought was for their marriage. So they bare their soul. They talk about their struggles. They say, help me understand how to communicate with him or her. Help me understand how to get them to see what I'm trying to say. And in the midst of that, there's this unexpected deepening of this quote unquote innocent relationship. And before you know it, you are in a place that you never thought you'd be, whether it's an emotional affair or it becomes physical. And so guardrails are very important once you get married. You've got to establish, what are you okay with? How will you engage the opposite sex? What kinds of conversations will you have with them and will you not have with them? What are the boundaries?
Yeah, absolutely. So boundaries, that's a great segue into, like, let's just take that point that you're making a little bit further, and maybe, like, let's talk through a couple of scenarios. So you mentioned the scenario of the wife or the husband who's had a friend from childhood that's of the opposite sex. So there's one scenario. What about a scenario, like, maybe let's get back to the intro when we were talking about, you and I both work with, so we're females and we work with a lot of men. So what about lunch with a coworker of the opposite sex, or meeting up after work with the person of the opposite sex that you work with, commuting together to work. So let's talk about some of those boundaries, and either on those, like, specific scenarios, or just in general, your thoughts on some boundaries and guardrails you could place in that type of scenario.
Again, I think it depends on what's happening in your relationship. And we could talk about this for hours. So I'll give a couple of examples.
Okay.
Let's say lunch. If you are going away to a place and you are having lunch by yourselves I would tell you, you need to be really careful. I would also ask the question, does your spouse know you're doing that? Because if you're setting up lunch with someone and you don't tell your spouse, that's a sign that something's going on. Like there's way more. It's not just friends.
Yeah.
And so you're in the danger zone. Second thing I would say is let's just take the commute example. Maybe there really is a scenario where it makes tons of sense, and just because of the nature of things, you could find yourself in a work situation. If you work, let's say, police department, fire department, you're always with opposite sex doing your work. You have to put up boundaries with these people because you are dealing with very traumatic situations. You are saving each other's life, literally. Yeah. And when you do things like that, there is a trauma bond that occurs. And so you feel very connected to that person, but you have this spouse at home. So strong boundaries. Even in my work relationship, I really appreciate and value not only the people I work with, but their spouses and my spouse. And so therefore, I will always err on the side of being extremely cautious out of respect for all of the other people involved here. I don't want anyone to ever question my motives. Yeah. And I think that that's something that you always have to ask yourself. Would my spouse wonder, or would their spouse question what's happening? I had a really good friend who, well-intentioned, told a coworker that she could run with him because she was training for a marathon. And they spent like an hour and a half together every morning. He leads a busy life, has children, and I just asked him when I saw him one day, I said, hey, so who's the chick you're running with? And he said, oh, it's someone who's training for a marathon. We work together. And I said, well, how's your wife feel about that? And he said, she's fine with it. And I was asking him questions like, how much uninterrupted time do y'all have together just having conversation? And it was like 90 minutes. And I said, well, do you have 90 minutes of completely uninterrupted, focused time with your bride? And he said no. And it was like the light bulb went on for him. And I just said, I know you have no devious intentions. However, you have placed yourself in a compromising situation because you're just having nonchalant, appearingly meaningless conversation, but it means something. And you need to know that. It's still conversation. It's still connection. And so I think it's that whole spectrum that you have to take into consideration. It doesn't just boil down to, well, you don't trust me. It's about the set of circumstances surrounding how you're engaging with the opposite sex that can absolutely set you up to find yourself in a place you never intended to be.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple of times in there and previously too about some of the guardrails around the conversation. So I'm curious, based off of that, it seems meaningless conversation. And maybe you say, oh, we're just talking about the, football games that we were watching this weekend, or we're just talking about, our kids X, Y, and Z. But are there any things that you would say are like off limits? Like you should not talk about this thing or that thing.
The things that I have seen get couples sideways, one is, let's say that you're in a particularly tense or challenging time with your spouse, and maybe you feel like you're not on the same page. So you're really vulnerable to be with someone of the opposite sex that appears to be a better listener than your spouse, appears to be more understanding, seems funnier, or maybe they seem to think you're really smart and you feel like your spouse doesn't think you're really smart at the moment. All those things are very endearing. And so they can draw you in and make you feel closer and like, wow, this person, they get me. That could be dangerous. So if you're in a particularly vulnerable place or you're tired, I would say any conversations about your marriage would be off limits. I would also say, if you find yourself trying to set up situations where you would run into this person at the coffee pot, at lunch, on a run, like you're intentionally timing things because you think you might see them, if your heart starts beating a little faster in anticipation of, those are all signs that you are in a very dangerous place. If you're texting and you wouldn't want your spouse to know that you're texting them, if you're doing things in secret, those are all signs that you're in a very dangerous place with this person. And you have to draw that line.
Yeah. You anticipated my next question, which was going to be, how do you know if you're in the danger zone? And so it's those things. It's intentionally setting up or intentionally trying to set up times where you might bump into them, or texting on the side, things like that. So that is definitely helpful. Do you have any other things that you thought of just now as, oh, that might be something that's in the danger zone?
Well, and I would say Dr. Shirley Glass did some really fantastic research in this area, and she wrote a book called Not Just Friends.
Okay.
And she does a tremendous job of walking through. It's all the things, like if you find yourself thinking about them when you're home with your spouse, if you find yourself wishing you were with them in their company when you're actually at home with your spouse and your family, you're in a very dangerous place. And the thing of all of this is you don't want to get to that space because it's super difficult to start backing out of that. You can be done, but it's hard.
Right.
And so that's why I say in the beginning, you and your spouse having conversations about what feels respectful, what feels honoring of our marriage. We both trust each other, but just because you think somebody's for your marriage doesn't mean they are.
Yeah.
And so they could have ulterior motives and you just don't even realize it. You're very innocent and you think it's all fun and games, and it isn't. It is games, but not what you're thinking.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll link that book
Yes.
in the description of this podcast so that
Great.
people can go and try to find that resource if they want. You kind of set us up for the next question, which would be, how do you have those conversations with your spouse? So you start to feel like, okay, maybe we're getting in the danger zone here, or I'm seeing something, maybe they're not seeing it. So how do you talk about that with your spouse? Because that's very sensitive, right? Like now there's opportunity for you to get defensive. Maybe it feels like they're calling you out, or just in general. I mean, it's a vulnerable, like sensitive conversation. Yeah. Feelings could get hurt, all the things. So what would you say about just handling that in your marriage relationship? How do you have this sensitive conversation of like, hey, is this respectful? Is this okay? Do we have appropriate boundaries in place? What would you say to that?
Well, I agree with you. I think it can be a hard conversation. But I think first and foremost, what does it look like to honor God in your marriage? What is God honoring all the way around? And if we're looking at things from that lens, then we're going to be respectful of each other. So I have found in lots of instances, a spouse doesn't necessarily see, hey, that person's like really, really friendly with you. And the other, the person is like, oh, no, they're just who they are. You need to listen to your spouse. A lot of times they can see things that you can't see. And I have had people say, well, you're just super jealous. Sometimes that's the case. Most times, more often than not, they really are seeing that, hey, it's too close for comfort. And I'm uncomfortable. And that's what I think the other person needs to hear is, I'm uncomfortable. And if your spouse is uncomfortable, they're first. Like, you can't care more for that friendship than you care for your marriage relationship. So the conversation can go towards, what are we comfortable with? I have opposite sex friends, but I am really, really careful with those relationships. I don't ever do marriage work with them. I don't talk about Jay in any kind of a negative way with them, and I'm never by myself with them. And I'm very, very careful with that because I don't want Jay to wonder ever if he's my priority or not. And so when I think you look at things from that lens, it's a different perspective. And are there relationships that you end up giving up or becoming more distant with? Yes. Yes. And I do it with joy because my marriage is first. And he's the one that I'm on this journey with for the long haul.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me throw one more scenario at you that just came to me thinking about Cody and I. We have a ton of couple friends.
Mm-hmm.
So not necessarily one-on-one relationships with those of the opposite sex, but we have a ton of couple friends, whether they're dating, engaged, married, whatever the case may be. And so just kind of curious from that perspective, boundaries on, okay, so you have these couple friends, but then is there ever a time or would there ever be a time where there would be like a one-on-one? Are you forming a friendship with one of the opposite sex? Does this make sense what I'm saying? Like what happens in those types of scenarios?
I think that's a great question for a couple of reasons. One, when you have couple friends in your marriage, it is really important that you both like both of the people. Not just, oh, she's my friend, so we're going to do this, but that you both like the other couple, husband and wife. And then to take it further in what you were describing, if someone came and said, can I talk with you? I would 100% pull Jay in because I need his perspective, and I would not talk alone to the person of the opposite sex about their marriage relationship. And I have actually had that happen. Could I come talk with you? I'm really struggling. And I've said, I'm happy to talk with you, but Jay would be a part of this conversation because I think we know you all as a couple, and I think his perspective is also really valuable.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
So last question, it's a little touchy, but I think it's worth asking because I think people, there might be someone out there in this, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, but want to break it down just a little bit more now. What do you do if you're in the situation where not only are you in the danger zone, but you have started developing feelings for that person of the opposite sex that is not your spouse?
One, acknowledge it. Admit it to yourself and don't play around, but be serious about, okay, this is not cool. And that means that you need to back away. So being around them, even if it's a coworker, you need to put some boundaries in place for yourself that you're not putting yourself in situations where you need to spend any more time around them than is required for whatever work assignment is. And if you have to work very, very closely with them, or you find yourself having to be around them, then perhaps putting some other scenarios in place so that you're not by yourself. Maybe there's another coworker, or there are other people that are involved in the mix. So you are not by yourself. And then the other thing you need to put into play is, how will you tell your spouse? And how will forgiveness has got to be in the mix. So there's an apology that's in order, and how am I going to make sure that I'm communicating with you and I'm not putting myself in a position to let this continue, happen again with someone else? Like, what will we do? And it could be that you need to seek out counseling to have a third party help you navigate that road. There are some really excellent books on this that we can attach to this podcast. Dave Carter has done some excellent work on this, as have others. So we can include that. But acknowledging it is the first step, and not ignoring like, oh, I can handle this by myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was definitely a challenging conversation, but I know that it's a good one to have. Like, it's definitely worth discussing. And people experience this and people are asking. So we want to provide those answers for them. I appreciate you just walking it through with me and kind of navigating this conversation. So anything else you would like to add?
I think I just would say, this isn't a sign of weakness. It's just, it is how relationships roll. And if we aren't on our guard and paying attention, very innocent friendships can move to a different space. And I think that prevention, man, it's less painful. It's just less painful. So if you can think about it ahead of time and put the parameters in place, your life will be richer and your marriage will be much more satisfying.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie.
My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to this conversation on whether or not opposite sex friendships can exist in marriage. As you heard, it's not a black or white, but we hope you got something from this conversation that will be helpful. We'll be back next week with another episode of the WinShape Marriage Podcast. Have a marriage question you'd like answered on the show? We'd love to hear from you. Visit winshapemarriage.org/podcast to submit your question today.